Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the second episode of our podcast series. Today, we are thrilled to continue our exploration of the most pressing issue in European politics, delving deeper into the evolving landscape of elections and governance. Joining us for this insightful discussion, it's our friend Nicholas Zalewski, an estimated expert in international relations and European affairs, currently pursuing his PhD at the University of Napoli Federico II. Hello, Nick.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
As we dive into the complexities of European politics, Nicholas brings a wealth of knowledge and expertise to our conversation, and I'm so glad to have him near us. With his deep understanding of international relations and his unique perspective as American citizen on European affairs, we are excited to gain valuable insights into the challenges and opportunities shaping the future of the European Union. So, ladies and gentlemen, sit back, relax, and let's embark on another illuminating journey of analysis and discussion. The first part of our discussion, we prepare a very interesting subject in examining the stark differences in GDP per capita between the European Union and the United States. It's crucial to consider the underlying factors shaping these economic landscapes. Firstly, the United States boasts a larger and more unified market compared to the European Union market, which comprises multiple sovereign nations with diverse economic structures and levels of development. This structural difference inherently impacts GDP per capita calculations, as the US economy benefits from a larger population base and a more streamlined regulatory framework conducive to economic growth. Additionally, we know that the United States has historically prioritized innovation, entrepreneurship, and technological advancement, driving productivity gains and fostering economic dynamism. From Silicon Valley startups to Wall Street's financial pose, the US economy thrives on a culture of innovation and risk-taking, failing, of course, sustain growth and prosperity. This innovation-driven model not only boosts GDP per capita, but also enhance living standards by creating high-paying jobs and fostering opportunities for upward mobility. Furthermore, the US benefits from favorable demographic trends, including a younger population and higher workforce participation rates compared to many European countries. This demographic dividend translates into a higher level of productivity and economic output, contributing to a higher GDP per capita. Moreover, the US economy's resilience and adaptability have been evident, and its ability to weather economic downturns to recover quickly from crises such as the Great Recession and the COVID-19 pandemic. Nick, please tell us your opinion about this huge gap between the European Union market and the US.
Yes, I will sure will. Before I do that, though, just a quick reminder for everyone to subscribe to the channel and go ahead and leave a comment from where you're watching from, what nation, and whether or not you agree with our opinions or not on these matters.
Thank you
But
very
now
much.
to tackle the matter, like you said, part of it is because the United States favors innovation, while the European Union definitely is more tax heavy to provide different services that aren't necessarily provided by the government to citizens, such as healthcare, where it's public systems here in Europe, while there might be some private options based off of what jobs offer and what insurance people want to buy. However, in the United States, essentially is completely privatized healthcare. And part of the problem with this is that there's definitely more of an incentive for Americans to go and find high paying opportunities in order to pay for their own costs, while Europeans can rely more on their governments. So unfortunately, this does lead to more innovation within the United States and the European Union, where there's just this gap in behavior between citizens, where with some they know that they definitely should get out of bed every morning and make sure that they're doing well with their jobs. While with the European Union, there's much more job security as well, where it's harder to fire people rather than the United States, where so many states within my nation, it's at will employment, which means you could be fired instantly without given a reason, which definitely increases people's willingness to make sure that they do go out and do a good job every day going to work. Whether people agree with this or not, it's hard to say, and we'll see what happens in the next years to come, particularly when the weight of the services in Europe are really felt on citizens, especially in member states with declining populations, such as Italy. This is a major concern, like you mentioned, with the United States. It's largely been a nation of immigration ever since its founding. So people are used to this. And while you do see some people resistant to different shifts in the nation, at the same time, there's still a much more willingness to welcome people of different nations, where you see it as a nation of a melting pot where people can bring their traditions to the United States without problem. Within the European Union, people are much more resistant. And just to give a silly example from Italy, look at how Italians react if you mention putting pineapple on pizza. I mean, when you have that huge difference in culture and what people are willing to accept or not of the outsider who comes to their nation, then that puts a big strain on whether or not you're going to have population growth in the future, including the United States. So all the nations we're discussing really need to work on raising their fertility rate, or they're also going to have to possibly reduce the services that they provide for free for citizens. We're seeing a huge burden that just can't be dealt with. And within Italy, I noticed that myself as a foreign PhD student who needs to enroll in healthcare in order to maintain my residency permit. While I was previously allowed to enroll in the Italian national system for only 151 euros per year, this was then raised dramatically from last year to this year from 151 euros to 700 euros. That's an incredibly huge increase for us. As you know, that's over half of a monthly income for us. So luckily I was able to find a private insurance. However, it definitely shows that Italy's healthcare system is feeling the weight, and it's trying to look where it could raise costs. As Italians who are born and have citizen, they don't need to pay just to enroll in the system. So Italy can't raise costs on them. At the same time, when you have foreign workers in Italy who are then automatically enrolled because they're paying taxes from their salary, well, they're not paying either. So what remains? Raising it on foreign students who do not have that right, unfortunately, where we have to enroll voluntarily, but we need that for the visa or the residency permit. But at the end, now we see how much those healthcare costs have risen. And we see that in other member states as well. In the Netherlands, a PhD student from Italy, even though Italy and the Netherlands are both in the EU, both in Schengen area, unfortunately, her healthcare coverage does not cover over. So a PhD student I know is stuck paying 140 euros just to be a part of the Dutch system. We're seeing these tremendous costs, and it's just getting to the point we're definitely seeing the cracks already with what services are able to be provided. And unfortunately, I really say that it's not going to get much better looking at our generation. Looking at millennials, looking at Gen Z, and then looking the generation after, you definitely see a shift in people not wanting to prioritize family and rather prioritize themselves and enjoying life, which, yes, we should all strive to enjoy life, but at the same time, what this means is fewer kids for the future in order to then help pay taxes and work and contribute to our societies, and in order to pay for different services that we want to provide to people in old age. Right now, you see a lot of people angry that retirement ages are rising. Well, what's other choice? And part of the issue is that people love to say, well, let's just allow more immigration. But the problem is, if immigrants aren't willing to learn the language of the host nation, what good paying jobs are they going to get in order to help contribute to the system? We've seen a lot of data, especially from the Netherlands, that came out during the last election that shows that different immigrants, unfortunately, from different parts of the world, the Dutch government is paying out more to them than they're contributing in taxes because they're finding low paying jobs. And then the Dutch government has to contribute different services still to them since they are working. But if they're paying out more to immigrants than they're getting, that's not a net positive for immigration. And European Union nations and the United States have to definitely be concerned with this and realize, okay, is it a net positive or is it not? You have to be really careful with immigration in that matter, unfortunately. And then the second thing is, unfortunately, as you're very well aware, different EU member states are winners in the debate not in the debate, in the competition for immigration, while others are clear losers. Other nations that have higher paying salaries, even if they also have higher living costs that accompany that, they're gaining a lot of immigrants from other EU member states that they're able to take from. So looking at Romania, Poland, Bulgaria that have lost millions together of their own population, looking at Romania that lost 1 million citizens just to Italy alone. That's a huge loss for their own workforces. And the problem is when we're seeing that, sure, you might see some immigration from other nations that have lower wages. So looking, for example, that with Poland, it has quite a bit of immigration from Ukraine. Even before the war, honestly, they had immigrants coming. But at the same time, it's not enough to replace the immigrants they lost. And then at the same time, as we're seeing too, and as you're well aware, Ukraine has made it known that it's their goal to join the European Union. It's their goal to reform. It's their goal to crack down on corruption. We're not going to be seeing then immigration as much necessarily in the future from Ukraine to other nations, or also Albania, for example, which is still waiting to become a member state. As they keep on developing and you're seeing economic growth, immigration is going to slow. And okay, well, what's going to be the source then? And that's the issue, that people don't necessarily realize that while some member states can, obviously, in the United States as well, could count on immigration in order to still try to provide these services, that's not always the case, depending on what jobs those immigrants are able to take. If, yes, they might be able to fill low-skilled job gaps in the market, but at the same time, if they're then taking more services from the nation than helping fund through their taxes, nations have to realize, well, okay, based on that specific job, is it really necessary? Or could there be innovation in other ways? So for example, as we're seeing that as well, where when you go into different fast food places such as McDonald's within the United States or Europe, you're seeing where a lot of times they just want you to go to a computer screen, pay yourself with a credit card. The only time you're paying to an actual person is if you insist on paying with cash. And as more and more people shift to just paying with a credit card, debit card, etc., well, that means a lot less workers in those restaurants. And then you're seeing different ways where instead of having many workers at all, even with food preparation, they're trying to move to robots. So it's hard to say. There's so many different aspects of this where we're just seeing where while with social services, especially within the European Union, there's more of a desire to have the governments be able to provide for them. People have to realize, well, that also means putting in the hard work in order to pay taxes that fund those. So as people always love to joke that with the European Union, there's more vacation time, there's more benefits, there's this and that. People also have to realize that they have to crack down and really work in order to be earning more money to pay for that, or those services are going to start disappearing.
Yeah,
And we're already seeing that even already with the healthcare system. So for example, with Italy, so even when you enroll in the national healthcare system, you're supposed to have a general doctor you could go to. I got really sick last year, and unfortunately, even though that doctor likely would have been able to treat me outside the hospital and just prescribe me some medication to help my throat
Mhm.
relax after it was inflamed, or I needed some steroids in order to be able to eat and drink properly, I ended up having to go to the hospital since he was only in his office 6 hours, wasn't there for several days when I really needed to go. So without any options, I'm then stuck putting an additional strain on hospital resources.
Yeah, but I want to turn back to a point that you underlined very clear. You mentioned the losers and the winners of the welfare system of European Union. And it's clear that we have interruption of welfare system within the European Union. Why is this, and how can we fix it?
Honestly, I would almost argue that probably one of the biggest mistakes for poor EU member states was that within the Schengen area, when they join within the European Union, then there's only a maximum of 7 years that wealthier member states could put restrictions on those citizens moving there. While for individual citizens, of course, they were eager to move to wealthier nations, but as we see, that puts a humongous strain on these poorer member states that are expected to help pay for, well, pay completely for the education of their citizens, from elementary school to if they go through college, advanced degrees such as becoming a doctor. You know, for example, in particular, this is a big issue in Bulgaria and Romania, where that's an incredible amount of time that these member states spend educating doctors, only for
That's
them to
true.
then go to Germany, for example.
That's true. That's true.
And honestly, there should have been more restrictions on immigration within the European Union until member states that have such a huge economic divergence, particularly looking at GDP per capita and wages, it should have been waited until it was more equalized because there was such a huge flood out of citizens. And while in some member states, for example, I could have sworn Lithuania, where you're slowly seeing people starting to come back, where it's having actually positive net immigration over the past couple years, it's still not enough to make up for everyone that it's lost in the past. And this is a huge issue not only for Lithuania, but the other Baltic states, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria. And even looking at Italy, it's an issue where, because of its, even though it's one of the founding members of the European Union, because it has lower wages than the median, you are seeing where tens of thousands of citizens are leaving every year. And then because of such a low fertility rate of about what, 1.25 kids per woman, with an aging population, you're seeing the population shrink the past several years, which is a huge issue for the third largest nation in the European Union.
Yeah, but however, the European Union also boosts several things that contribute to its economic resilience and competitiveness on the global stage. Firstly, we can mention Europe's social welfare system, provided that provide a safety net for citizens, ensuring access to healthcare, as you mentioned, education and social service, regardless of socioeconomic status. While these expenditures may impact GDP per capita calculations, they contribute to a higher quality of life and greater social cohesion compare with other nations. Additionally, Europe's commitment to environmental sustainability and renewable energy transition positions that position the continent as a global leader in green technology and innovation, fostering long-term economic growth while mitigate climate change risks. But also, moreover, I think the European Union benefits from a robust regulatory framework that prioritize consumer protection, worker rights, and environmental stewardship, where these regulations may impose I don't know, compliance costs on businesses. They also contribute to a more equitable and sustainable economic model, reducing, of course, the income inequality and promoting inclusive growth. So let's talk a little bit about this economic model and make a comparison with the US model.
Yeah, it is interesting because while some people definitely do expect it to have better protection within the European Union than the United States, it's necessarily isn't always true. So, for example, me just looking at the fact that while typically I'm 99% certain that the exact statistic is that European Union citizens have 14 days to return goods without questions. So, but the problem is with the enforcement of this. So, even though that's the case, I've been into many stores here in Naples, Italy, where they'll try to say, oh, we'll do an exchange, or no, we won't do a refund. And one time in the airport, I was able to speak in Italian on behalf of a fellow American who realized that I spoke Italian, and we were on the same flight because she was tricked about the price of a purse. She thought she was simply buying a fake leather purse. It turns out to be a real leather purse, about 5 or 6 times the price, and she wasn't prepared to spend that much. But because they ran her credit card, they tried to say, oh, no returns. So then I had to get after them and say, according to European Union legislation, she has 14 days. She just bought it. Obviously, it's within the time frame. So part of the problem is that while you have some of these benefits, on the other hand, too, I've met plenty of European Union citizens who don't realize that you're legally allowed to return goods without giving a reason. So while after the 14 days, the stores may be able to say, okay, we won't give you a refund, but we're willing to give you a different size, a different color if you prefer. But the problem is, the European Union is really good sometimes at working on these regulations, but they're not good at making this known to citizens. So citizens don't always know about their rights, unfortunately. And then part of the issue too is looking at some of these regulations. While in some ways it makes the European Union look good as a global leader, looking towards them trying to make industry greener energy sources, the issue is some of it is greenwashing, where people aren't always looking at whether or not this is really good for the environment with different decisions that are made. But also the bad reality is that sometimes this also makes the European Union less competitive because with some of these initiatives of trying to become carbon neutral at such an aggressive rate compared to the rest of the world, what this means is it's going to increase production costs even more within the European Union than usual. And as we've seen in the United States, there's been a lot of deindustrialization for this, which has led to job loss, especially with higher paying jobs for people working in factories producing goods, rather than this high reliance on low skill retail and maybe different service jobs. So trying to get people to sign up for phone plans or whatever you want it. Different jobs that it's relatively easy to train people for, but it's also significantly lower wages than if they were in a factory producing different goods here within the European Union. And that's the issue that the European Union has to realize that if it's too aggressive, it's just going to chase away different production outside the European Union that hasn't already been chased out. And one of the biggest examples that we see right now is looking at food production, where
because because you mentioned the competitivity of the EU market, let me
yeah,
share with you a charta that you gave me, and I really want to comment with you the data in this charta. If you can share your thoughts about this gap between, for example, Luxembourg and Ireland, and Bulgaria and Romania, Greece, the lowest GDP per capita
yeah.
score.
Well, part of it too is that we also have to be fairly cautious looking at Luxembourg and Ireland. Particularly with Luxembourg, is because it has a much higher GDP per capita, partially based off of the fact that it has so many workers who come across its borders and working and contributing to the economy, but then they don't live there. So then they're not included because GDP per capita isn't being divided based off of the number of workers in that country. It's being based off of who lives within that country. So when you have people from nearby nations, particularly looking at France, uh, who drive in every day and then go out, that helps raise the GDP per capita. And then the issue with Ireland right away, which is a well-known issue, is the fact that it's essentially recreated its identity as a tax haven, where you have large companies who move there to pay lower corporate taxes, very close to zero, where this hurts Ireland because while it's attracting these companies, it's not attracting huge tax revenue. It's mainly just in name only increasing the GDP per capita, but not really because it's mainly the tax books that are there at the headquarters. It's not that they're actually producing more goods. In the end, it's not that it's necessarily increasing the number of jobs in that country. And then people just also have to pay attention to and realize that when nations such as Luxembourg or Ireland have a higher GDP per capita, or looking at states such as New York, everything costs more then. So it's not instantly indicative that it has a better quality of life than a poor nation. Sure, you could be paid more in the state of New York than, for example, looking more near the bottom, that's visible, Oklahoma. But at the same time, or even Mississippi, which is last. The problem is a lot of things are costing more in New York than Mississippi. So yes, you're being paid more, but you better be prepared to pay higher rent or mortgage, more money for gas, more money for food, more money for everything. And it really depends more on how you compare to the rest of that population in that state. If you're above the median income for an individual or a family, then yes, you're beneficial in that state. However, even if you're in a wealthier nation or US state, but you're significantly below the median income, it is not better for you then than if you were to potentially live in a state where you could be above the median income. Because the harsh reality is, if you're below the median income, that means it's harder for you to compete with people to pay rent for apartments or be able to buy a home. And that's not a better quality of life then, if everything's then more costlier for you than looking at other families. And that's the harsh reality that people have to keep in mind, that just because a US state might have a higher GDP per capita than an EU nation, that doesn't necessarily mean it's better based off of that family's individual income or potential of income if they're thinking of leaving their EU nation for a specific US state. But then they also have to keep in mind that it also only applies where they're at a slight disadvantage if they're trying to buy a lot of US goods. So it is true that for EU nations that have a lower GDP per capita, it's going to become more expensive to buy specific products, such as if someone really likes an Apple iPhone instead of a cheaper smartphone option. Well, yes, it's going to be more expensive than if you were living in the United States making a US income. But at the same time, there's the issue too that if that's not a priority for you, then that really doesn't have too much of an impact for you. People have to really realize that it comes down more to your individual situation, and that people love to be in this competition and look at averages and think, oh, well, just because, for example, also Germany has a higher GDP per capita than Romania. Well, if that Romania family is near the top of income within Romania, but then they wouldn't be able to find as high of an income source if they were moved to Germany, then they're not better off. And there was actually a good article about this, which I'll try to find for you so you can link in the comments of this video then, talking about a Romanian woman who was in the top 10% of income earners in Romania, and she moved to New York thinking her life would be better. But in the end, because she struggled to be as competitive within New York, she wasn't able to afford as nice as a life as she was in Romania. So after 10 years in New York, she actually moved back and realized that no, in fact, it is better for her to be living in Romania than New York based off of her life expectations. So people have to be really concerned about that rather than looking at the news headlines, because people
Mhm.
love to put out these catchy headlines to sell newspapers, get people to read articles online and saying, oh my gosh, look at GDP per capita. United States is winning the war compared to the European Union average. But at the same time, it's much more nuanced than that. And people really need to consider their own financial situations and what they expect.
Yeah, but also we have a huge gap, a huge difference between the north of the European Union. We have here Denmark, Sweden, and the north, of course, the most happiest countries in the world. And at the bottom of the chart, we have the east and the south. So, what's your opinion about this reality, and how can the European Union contribute to reduce this huge difference between the north and the south, between the north and the east?
Well, definitely what would definitely be one of the top solutions, which, as you know, within the European Union, members of the European Parliament would never go for, it would never get passed, would be more of a trying to create a universal minimum wage across the EU. But
Mm-hmm.
as people argue, because of different living costs, you're never going to get that. So until there's more economic convergence between member states, we're still going to see a difference between GDP per capita. And people still have to keep in mind too that just because a member state appears to be richer on paper than another, they also have to really look at that. Well, what does that entail? Are people actually better off based off of those individual goals as well? So, for example, for me, one of my top goals would be to own my own home. So I don't have to worry about paying a rent when I'm in my
Mm-hmm.
retirement years. I don't want to deal with raising rents and possibly then having a precarious living situation. I'd rather prefer to have a mortgage-free home, have the mortgage paid off during my working years, and have that. Well, the reality is that a lot of times home ownership rate is higher in East and Southern member states than Northern and Western member states. For example, uh, to pick out a little bit at Germany, even
Mm-hmm.
though it's constantly considered as one of the best member states with a growing economy, although that's been slowing in recently because Chinese industry is becoming more competitive with Germany. So you're seeing slowly seeing deindustrialization in Germany, which did not necessarily occur as it did previously in other member states such as Italy, Spain, and France, where they saw industry leaving for outside the European Union. The issue is Germany has the lowest home ownership out of any EU member state. So it really depends on your goals. Well, yes, you could be earning a higher salary in Germany, but than your previous member state. Okay, but where are you along the income spectrum? Because as it is, it was something outrageous, like only about 49% of Germans own their own home. So the
Mm-hmm.
odds are stacked against you. And that's a harsh reality that people need to accept that sometimes, while it looks better on paper, that's not always the reality. And particularly looking at Germany, this is important because currently, by constitutional law, Germany cannot operate at a budget deficit. It has to always pass a balanced budget. Well, the issue is, while it wants to provide services to its citizens, this means that a lot of times with those who are already retired, even though they're seeing living costs dramatically increase, they're not seeing their pensions increase.
Mm-hmm.
So the issue is you're seeing different Germans becoming homeless because they have to choose whether they want to be able to buy food the next day or if they want to be hungry but have a roof over their head. And that's a really terrible reality for someone to be in. But that's definitely a point that people need to pay attention at and realize that, with the home, that's the largest investment that someone could make. especially if they're more middle class. If you're a millionaire, well, okay, forget about it. You have many options and you probably have plenty of investments. But for the middle class, the largest purchase that would be an investment for you would be your home. And people need to realize that while sometimes it looks better on paper and it might be like, wow, look at this. Moving to this member state, it would have a higher GDP per capita than where I'm currently living. Well, okay, but what's the income expectation for your career? If it's a very well paying career where you're going to be near the top of the income, then by all means. However, if you're going to be lower on the spectrum than you are in your home member state, then you might have to realize, well, that means you're going to have a different quality of life.
Yeah, and of course we should recognize that we need European Commission more involved in this problem. And I ask you this because I had a very interesting conversation with a Romanian American analyst, and he told me that achieving regulatory cohesion within the European requires careful coordination and consensus building among the member states with diverse economic interests and policy priorities, which it's not present in the US political life. But while common taxation policies may help reduce regional disparities, I think they must be implemented in a manner that balances the need of different regions and respect national sovereignty. And this is very important because the European Union, it's not a state, it's an organization. But moreover, efforts to harmonize regulations should prioritize I don't know, flexibility and why not adaptability to accommodate the
I think we also have to be a little cautious on also intervening too much. In some of these member
okay.
states, it is important to let their economies develop before trying to do anything. And I do say this because looking at different member states that didn't necessarily have the infrastructure that they do now and continue to develop when they first joined the European Union. So, for example, thinking of mind Poland, which
Okay.
has rapidly been developing its railways, also been developing its highway infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
Having a difference in salaries and having a difference in GDP per capita has been beneficial, where it was able to attract different jobs because how companies were able to then have cheaper production costs rather than being in a wealthier member state. And the big issue is if we try to push for everything to be equal salaries, then a lot of companies would say, well, let me just stay in a more developed member states such as Germany. Why move production to Poland if everything costs the same, but there's less infrastructure? However, looking at that because those differences have existed with economic divergence, you are seeing Poland's economy catching up with Germany because it didn't have this huge economic manipulation of trying to automatically raising wages to be equal to Germany. And this is important because this also helps employment rate. If you try to raise salaries too high, you could risk high unemployment because people are just refusing to pay that income right away.
I
But
totally
we're also
agree.
seeing that while you had companies previously moving production, moving jobs to Eastern EU member states because things were cheaper, you're also seeing where these member states are now highly specializing in production and different research jobs, where now, even though wages are going up as the economies are developing, companies aren't pulling those jobs out because they realize, well, wait a minute, look at how far the Polish economy has come. There is no reason for us to leave because it is becoming highly specialized. So we're seeing benefits of still staying, even if it means paying wages that are increasingly closer to those in Germany. And looking at this is beneficial though, because of how you do see the economic development. And to be fair, with the European Union, in order to help economic convergence, you do see a flow of some member states paying more to the EU budget, while others especially regions that have a lower GDP per capita than EU average, they're then able to receive funds to help themselves develop and try to become more competitive. So then they're on the same playing field. And this has been widely successful. I mean, it's getting to the point that there's actually estimates that the Polish railway could actually become the most developed within the entire European Union, which, let's be honest, if we were having this discussion back in 2004 when Poland was just joining, that would have just been a very distant dream where people could just say that, a Polish politician, and people would just think, no, there's no way that that would happen.
Yeah,
So
I'm sure that this will be a very hot topic on the elections agenda. But turning to the upcoming EU elections, the outcome holds significant implications for the future trajectory of the European economy. For example, the conception of the European Parliament will shape the legislative agenda and will determine the direction of economic policy, influencing, of course, the key issues such as taxation, trade, and financial regulation. And depending on the electoral results, we could see a shift towards more progressive or conservative policies with, I don't know, with the potential ramifications for economic growth, social welfare, and environmental sustainability. What's your opinion? How will look the upcoming EU Parliament?
well, part of the issue is that because so much focus in the media is comparing member states to one another and comparing the EU to the United States, it's definitely going to be in the favor of these sometimes crazy and insane populist parties, because I definitely say that looking, for example, at Bulgaria. Even though Bulgaria has had such amazing economic development since it joined the EU in 2007, so not even 20 years yet, you actually have a large part of the Bulgarian population thinking maybe we would have been better staying aligned with Russia. And the issue is that with the media, they're not busy uh, being more realistic, comparing member states to itself, and seeing that a lot of these member states have made incredible progress and being congratulatory to them. Instead, the constant news is, oh, look at Bulgaria. It's still the poorest member state within the European Union. And it's like, yes, but let's be honest. Let's look at the starting point. Bulgaria had much lower average wages than other member states in the EU. So looking at Bulgaria, looking at 2013, the average worker was earning less than 400 euros a month. Now they're earning over 800 euros a month. If the media was being honest and doing its job, it would be pointing this out to the Bulgarian public and saying, you absolutely would not be better with Russia. Look at how low wages in Russia are. It's nowhere near having an average wage of over 800 euros a month per worker. It's significantly lower than that. And also the minimum wage is also significantly lower than that. But looking at Bulgaria, looking at its minimum wage now, its minimum wage is what the average wage was just a couple years ago. That shows how high growth wages are growing within Bulgaria. And, you know, yes, it's important to see whether economic convergence is occurring between member states, but it is slowly occurring. If we do compare Germany's GDP per capita to that of Bulgaria, well, yes, they're still very far apart. At the same time, you are seeing it slowly converging because Bulgaria's GDP per capita is growing faster than Germany's. Same with a lot of other wealthier member states. And while that is a little more tricky looking at Italy, where it has had a much more stagnant economy, same with Greece, where they still have not achieved back their 2008 GDP per capita. We're unfortunately seeing how it's been stagnant. Economists also have to be more honest and pushing the honest narrative too, that when you look at Italy, let's be honest with ourselves. A large part of that is because a lot of workers who are able to earn a high income in Italy don't pay taxes.
Yeah.
So looking at plumbers who could earn a significantly high income, they're not reporting that to the government. And that makes their economies look worse than the economy actually is, because people are able to pay, people are earning money, but it's hidden from the actual statistics. So, for example, I just had a plumber here, as you know,
Mm-hmm.
who was working in my apartment. Pretty sure he officially billed for 7.5 hours of work. He was paid 550 euros. But because he insists on being paid in cash, he's not reporting that income to the Italian government. And let's be realistic. How many people in any member state, not just Italy, but even looking at Germany, how many workers could actually say that they could earn 550 euros working only 7.5 hours of work?
Yeah, yeah, and here it's not the EU's fault.
No, exactly. It's not the EU's fault. And the issue is because it's not, that point isn't driven home that one, if Italians want to continue these services, you have to be more forceful in pushing for people to all contribute and to pay their taxes and to contribute to the system. But it's also realistic to indicating that Italian's economy in reality is much larger than it shows. Also looking at, for example, the sports doctor I have to go to. Um, Forgive my lack of knowledge. I'm not sure how this compares for every EU member state. But for example, if you want to enroll in a gym in Italy, you
Okay.
have to go annually for a heart exam where they monitor you, where they have you do some exercise, and then they remeasure your heart to see how well your heart rate is. Well, anyways, that doctor for 10-15 minute appointment charges 30 euros. Of course, it's in cash because they're not paying taxes. If you were to try to pay with card, they upfrontly tell you they will charge you 40 euros because they don't want to pay with that with taxes. But the harsh reality is that with that doctor, it's a doctor and nurse team working together. That's it, where they rent a little room in this medical center to do this. They could well over earn because of how many days and if how many months they work. They could be earning well over 200,000 euros. But if most people are paying with cash instead of card, they could be earning over 200,000 euros that's not taxed. So what does that leave Italy with? A lot of the people who are being forced to tax are people who have lower paying jobs, such as working in a grocery as a cashier or as a stocker, where because it has less skill than a plumber
Mm-hmm.
or with a doctor or nurse, so they're stuck with having a regular contract where their paying taxes automatically withdrawn from their paycheck, and they can't try to hide that from the Italian government because the Italian government knows what they're actually being paid. But the problem is they're having a huge burden then placed on them paying the services for everyone. And so people have to be a little more honest and push for there to be more regulations within Italy and other member states where you see a large shadow economy.
Yeah, this is
And that's
why I'm asking for more EU regulation, more EU common checks regulations among the EU
which
states.
comes with the issue of not necessarily them willing to do that. So if we look at food, for example, so with food, there's different regulations that member states are supposed to follow with food quality, and you're
Mhm.
not supposed to have it where a company could sell a product it labels as the exact same in Poland as it sells in Sweden, Italy, France, Germany. But at the same time, when you actually look at the ingredients, it's not the same
It's
product
not the
because they're
same.
using, so for example, instead of using rapeseed oil, they're using palm oil, which has higher saturated fat. It's significantly less healthier for you than rapeseed
But
oil,
it's cheaper. But
but
it's
it's
cheaper.
cheaper. And companies then are putting that in the Polish version rather than in a product from another member state. And the issue is that the European Union, and same with the United States, because I took a food law course there as well, you could have as many regulations as you want, but the issue is, are you actually going to have people doing testing on whether or not people are abiding by those regulations? So, for example, you need to make sure that you're actually having European Union workers or if not European Union workers themselves, funding to each member state, where then the member states are hiring people to then be going and checking in these facilities and seeing whether or not people are actually following these procedures. Because there was an interesting article, which I'll send you, by Investigate Europe, independent journalism group. They did an article which did show that they said, to be fair, and this was just from 2 years ago, you actually don't necessarily see a direct geographic difference. So even though people do tend to perceive that food quality is worse in the East than the West, that's not necessarily true, where sometimes you see lowered meat content in ragu sauce in Western Europe than in the East. So there is that, where it's not necessarily the stereotype that people think, but still at the same time, they do show that when they because they have journalists from different EU member states, they all went to the grocery store, bought an item that has the exact same name, exact same label from the exact same company. And then one company in particular, a supermarket chain from Germany, we'll
Okay.
leave it at that so we don't get sued. So even though it's the exact same label, they try to say, oh, it's a different product. And the journalist even made a comment. No, it's labeled the same. And it's from this, everything's the same. Yet when you look at the ingredients, it's different. But the issue is, okay, but you don't necessarily see the enforcement with this. And part of the issue, I think, too, is the European Union is so dead set on putting regulations on technology companies from the US rather than building their own technology companies, because you're seeing a lack of innovation, particularly in technology in the European Union than the US. So a lot of times the European Union will try to win these huge lawsuits, win billions of euros from companies trying to say, oh, you're not paying taxes or you're not following EU regulations, particularly looking at the GDRP, which for anyone not watching who doesn't know, that relates to how companies must deal with your data.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, because the European Union is so focused on that, you're not seeing them actually also focus on protecting consumers with food regulations and seeing, okay, companies aren't able to supposed to sell different quality goods with a label the same, but are they actually doing that? Because just because you make a law doesn't mean people follow it. As you and I know, within the United States and the European Union, people go and break the law every day. They steal, they shoplift, they go murder someone.
Mm-hmm.
Just because it's a law doesn't mean that's going to mean that they're going to act in the correct way. And the European Union has to realize that's the same for food production companies.
Yeah, I really hope that the upcoming EU Parliament will put this issue on the top of its interest. And because you anticipated the subject I want to address in this second part of our discussion, I'd like to present a little bit the impact of climate change on Europe's farmers. And we both know that it's proven and multifaceted, this issue. Across the continent, agriculture communities and are grappling with the devastating effects of extreme weather events. I don't know, from scorching heat waves to prolonged droughts and catastrophic flooding. This climatic disruption not only jeopards crop yields and livestock production, but also undermine the economic viability of farming operations within the European Union, exacerbating existing challenges such as low consumer price and competition from cheap food imports, for example, from China and South America. But moreover, the agriculture sector, I think, it's increasingly linked to the broader environment, making in both a victim and a contributor to climate change, while farmers burn to brunt of its adverse effect. Their practice also play a significant role in shaping the landscape and influencing greenhouse gas emissions. As such, efforts to mitigate climate change must strike a delicate balance between addressing the sector's vulnerabilities and promoting sustainable agriculture practices that minimize its environmental footprint. In this context, Nick, the EU environmental rules have emerged as continuous issue for Europe's farmers, who argue that stringent regulations are exacerbating their already precarious situation, where these rules aim to promote environmental sustainability and mitigate the impact of climate change. Farmers continue that they impose additional burdens and constraints on their operations, hiding their ability to remain competitive in the global market. So, what's your opinion about the EU environmental rules and the agricultural regulations?
To be brutally honest, and I'm coming across as very critical of EU citizens today, but part of the issue is a lot of European Union citizens want their cake and eat it too. And the issue is, okay, but you need to pay more taxes. And a big issue, which is a little bizarre given where you're seeing pushback is, especially from more farther left European Union citizens, you're seeing a pushback on farm subsidies. But the issue is, how are you going to help maintain food production within the European Union while making it greener, which is going to significantly increase the cost? And at the same time, still expect them then to compete with all these nations who are not following the same regulations. And this is the bit of a challenge too, that people don't necessarily acknowledge, is that yes, while the European Union wants to be more forward thinking, more environmentally friendly than other continents. But the other issue is, but that also makes it much more expensive. Are people willing to pay higher costs for food for
Let's
it to
look
be
at some
still?
data. Let's look at some
Yeah.
data about the environmental protectionism. And we have here a chart that you provide me, all the world's carbon emissions.
Yes.
So we have a pretty clear image about this.
Well, and this is also very important for people to keep in mind because people really try to beat themselves over producing carbon emissions. But as we could see with Europe, by far, Turkey and Russia are some of the more responsible for producing carbon emissions, but neither one's within the European Union. So the European Union could try to decrease emissions as much as they want, but if Turkey and Russia do not follow suit, you're still going to have significant carbon emissions from Europe produced by those two nations. And
Mm-hmm.
the issue is that smaller nations are trying to become so forward thinking and trying to decrease the emissions and become carbon neutral. But the issue is when other nations are not, all they're doing is is making their products going to be significantly more expensive in the future, while other nations completely wipe out those reduction in emissions because they're continuing to increase. And it's not feasible. And looking at farmers and trying to say, oh, well, how dare you farmers have emissions? Okay, but what do you think is going to happen to food prices? You're going to have food production moving out of Europe because they just can't compete with other nations. And the other issue is that also has a significant impact because other nations are not as respectful with not using various chemicals, not using various pesticides, which could be dangerous and even cause cancer within consumers. So people have to realize, okay, do they want a lot of food production to remain within the European Union? Or if they're going to race themselves to a point where it's no longer competitive and not even want to help farmers pay those increased costs with subsidies. And part of the issue that has become famous within British debate, which I think is really relevant, is when we see on this map, the UK produces 0.9%
Percent, yeah.
of carbon emissions. in the world. So it's a lot of British conservatives who are a little more hesitant about being so gung-ho on decreasing emissions right away. They flat out say the United Kingdom could sink today, and by next year, our carbon emissions will then be produced in other countries such as China because they don't have the same strict regulation. They're not as concerned with decreasing emissions.
Of
So
course, and we reduce here, but will increase
yes,
in China because we'll be more vulnerable and more dependent to the Chinese economy.
and part of the issue is that especially with young people is with how many young people not realizing, not to sound like a boomer, but to be honest, a lot of young people do not realize how good they have it. And I gotta be honest that I'm probably rare for someone who comes from a city within the United States, one of the largest cities within the United States, but because we don't live immediately downtown, we still had a garden in the backyard. So I know how difficult it is to grow vegetables, such as cucumbers, peppers, eggplant, growing tomatoes. It could be months before you see anything grown. Yet you have arrogant people going to protests, and even though it's outside the EU, uh, uh, former EU member state, the United Kingdom, you had a really arrogant young punk at being interviewed who was protesting carbon emissions, saying we need to stop farming. Well, okay, but where do you think your food comes from in the supermarket? It comes from farmers. Even if the United Kingdom, even if every single European Union member state, the United States, was to say, okay, from tomorrow we're closing all farms. Okay, but the carbon emissions are and other emissions from farming are going to be produced in other nations then, who don't care about restricting it because all they care about is increasing their economies. Which, to be fair, part of that is because they want to achieve the same quality of life. They want to achieve the same economic development as Europe and the United States. So it cannot fault them completely. But the issue is that doesn't decrease emissions then. And a big issue that we need to be realistic about is we see this with industrialization. So taking a little step back from with the farmers and food production, let's look at factories. A lot of, and as people rightfully do state, looking at China, that's a huge percentage, 30.9% of carbon emissions. However, as people do point out, to be fair, this isn't all because of Chinese consumption. It's because of how many people are eager to buy cheaper products made in China within Europe and the United States that are then imported. And part of the issue is that looking at the United States and the European Union, they were really eager to place these environmental regulations on industrialization. And guess what? The factories closed up and they went to where nations were cheaper. To be fair, we cannot say this is just because of environmental regulations. This is also because of the difference in labor costs. But with there just being such a dramatic cost between production, that means that you cannot then expect that production is easily going to just adapt in order to produce less emissions. It might simply just go away, which, as I did research for an article, a lot of people in the Netherlands are concerned about this, and why you saw a lot of protests about this was that the Dutch know that after World War II, a lot of people were subsistence farmers, where they were stuck growing their own food because of how poor that nation was after World War II and how much destruction occurred. And the issue is with us younger people, we weren't alive to experience that. So while people could be shown pictures of how bad the destruction was, how desperate people were eating food out of garbage cans, people don't realize that because they forget what everything that goes into farming, how challenging it is. We just are so eager, especially with our generation. Well, let's pass a regulation and it's just going to magically happen. And
Yeah,
oh, by the way, we're not going to give farmers more money. In fact, we want to cut the subsidies because farmers get too many subsidies from the EU budget. We spend too much of the EU budget on farming. Well, but at the same time, this is also really important for independence and looking at Ukraine. Look at how many nations in North Africa and other parts of the world were really struggling with food because guess what? A lot of grain, they're dependent on Ukraine and Russia.
Mhm.
Well, thanks to Vladimir Putin, who decided he was going to do his special military operation in Ukraine.
True.
For us normal people, it's a full out invasion. That's not okay.
Yeah, but
Well, look at how much food prices surged then. There's videos that people could find on social media of people being desperate, and you're hearing women in North African supermarkets screaming and crying because they're realizing, oh my God, with how fast food prices are growing, I can't feed my family because my nation is so dependent on imports of different goods. So now we can't produce our own food. Do we really want that to be the future of the European Union where people have to be dependent on supplies coming from elsewhere or we can't produce it? Let's look at the pandemic and how serious that was. A lot of different parts for different hospital machinery that people and different face masks in order for people that thought that this could potentially cut down on transmission, help treat COVID-19. But the reality is, we were stuck because we didn't have the production power anymore because of how much production moved to China, Bangladesh, Vietnam, India. So the European Union and the United States, who were hit very early on with COVID-19, there was no production capability. Do people want that with food too, where then people are stuck on having food constantly imported? Imported food. Nations that depend on imported food, they have a lot less economic growth because of how expensive that is. And now, as we look further, let's be honest with ourselves. With international trade, while we thought supply chains were an issue with during COVID-19 and different factories being closed down in other parts of the world to try to shut down on transmissions, it's not getting any easier with supply chains when you're having different wars break out in other countries with the invasion of Ukraine. And now look at Yemen. The Houthis are essentially trying to bomb any ship in the canal that they try to say, well, because 10% of that ship is owned by X company and there's a single American or a single Jew on the board, we're going to attack the ship. Okay, well, that's one thing if you have different goods, but could you imagine if the European Union is dependent on food on those ships, and now those ships aren't able to pass? Because part of the issue is a lot of these ships that are being attacked, people are getting really upset with the Houthis because it's not weapons, it's food. Or it's simple everyday items that people are trying to buy. It's nothing to do with whether or not it's weapons going to Israel to with its war with Gaza. It's everyday products that have nothing to do with war. It's not going to Israel. It's not going to the United States. It's just everyday goods. And what do people expect? I just am very passionate about this because it's not a good position for people to put themselves in to be dependent on importing food. And I really encourage people that even if you live in an apartment, you don't have access to somewhere where you could plant outside, try to grow something such as a tomato plant from a seed within your apartment and realize how many months that's going to take you before you even have a single tomato grown that you could eat.
of course,
Farming is not easy as people think, and that's the issue too. Looking at France, it's so bad that you're having where it's almost every other day a French farmer is unaliving themselves. Okay,
yeah,
because
but the problem, Nick, I'm afraid that the populist politicians and politicians um, in they will not here in Europe, in the European Union, they will not recognize that this is a stupid thing. I'm afraid that the shakes of these policies are particularly high in the context of the electoral campaign for the European Parliament. And as politicians vie for votes and seek to articulate their vision for the future of Europe, the plight of farmers and the challenges they face in the wake of climate change have taken center stage. Of course, we have a climate and environmental crisis, but let's be realistic. Um, I'm sure that parties and candidates are under pressure to propose solutions that strike a balance between environmental conservation and agriculture viability of the union. But addressing the concerns of both families and environmental advocates, we can find the balance. And also, you mentioned, and I'm happy that you mentioned that the Ukrainian grain crisis adds another layer of complexity of the debate in the context of EU elections. The disruption in grain exports from Ukraine, one of the world's major bread baskets, has sent shockwaves throughout the global market. Also, the war in Israel and Yemen, leading to concerns about food security and supply chain resilience. And in this context, the role, I really think, the role of the European agriculture becomes even more critical as policymakers grapple with the need to ensure a stable and sustainable food supply while confronting the challenges posed by this climate crisis and environmental degradation. So I
But
really think,
unfortunately, I think we're not going to see this issue properly discussed within the European Parliament unless we actually have people being elected as members from rural communities where if they're not farmers themselves, they're well connected though to the farmers that community and they realize everything that goes into growing food. Because right now the issue is we have so many politicians who are just so removed from what it takes to growing food that they don't realize how difficult it is. They just think, oh, these farmers are just asking for even more money. They're being greedy. And as we know, that's not the reality. Farming is a very difficult job. It takes a lot out of these farmers. And the issue which nobody talks about is that because we keep on trying to put more and more regulations in order to help protect the environment. But the issue is now we're seeing such a dramatic decrease in how many people are even interested in working in agriculture in the future, which impacts food security as well. And the European Union has to realize that if it's making farming that difficult to earn income, but then at the same time they don't want to pay subsidies to these farmers, they have to realize, well, okay, but who's going to remain in order to do farming? It was interesting reading farmers who were protesting, and one mentioned from France that even though he could work 12 hours a day, he, at the end of the day, he must as well have just taken a 50 euro note from his wallet and burn it because he lost 50 euros that day because he wasn't being paid enough by supermarket chains in for his goods. So that's in particular why we saw in France
of course, but
them
this is why,
charging.
yeah, but this is why I ask a greater transparency and accountability in the implementation of the EU pollution policies to ensure that burden of compliance is distributed fairly and equitable among stakeholders. And I realize that without effective monitoring and enforcement mechanisms, there is a risk, a huge risk, that polluters may evade responsibility or engage in greenwashing practices, undermining the effectiveness of pollution reducing efforts. But while the EU's, and we should realize that while the EU's zero pollution policy represents a laudable ambition, truly, it is essential to carefully balance environmental objectives with economic realities and social considerations to achieve a sustainable and equitable outcomes from all stakeholders and for all European citizens.
But just the harsh reality is that we see so many disagreements between member states that it's even hard for there to be an agreement. I mean, if we could, discuss real quick, one of the most absurd things that we've ever seen was Germany, that even though the Green Party is part of the ruling coalition, they actually approved shutting down nuclear energy production to burn coal. We're really going to pretend that's better for the environment. Well,
Without
yes,
no
people could be
sense.
concerned about nuclear energy, how it has to be stored properly, but at the same time, when you look at the fact that not only do member states have to meet their own national regulations, they also have to meet European Union regulations. If it is properly enforced, nuclear waste could be stored safely. And you're not out there burning coal. And part of the irony, too, which I can't believe Poland didn't push more about this, was the fact that the Czech Republic and Germany took Poland to the European Court of Justice because they were trying to argue that, oh, well, there was pollution from a coal plant in southwest Poland that was polluting them. But it's like, but now Germany went out and burned coal? Come
Yeah,
on, that's obnoxious. And looking at the Netherlands too, which people don't realize that a lot of these Dutch farmers are upset because you actually have part of the official Dutch government plan is to decrease the number of farms without offering them any benefits. And while you don't see this argument within the European Union as much as the United States,
exactly.
it's really interesting watching in the United States. Right now, journalists are losing their jobs because newspapers aren't as popular, but different critics of the mainstream media do have a good point where when these journalists are upset about losing their job, a lot of critics of mainstream media have responded, learn how to code. Because you actually had these arrogant journalists telling that to coal miners in West Virginia. Oh, you're losing your job as a coal miner? Just learn how to code. How cruel could you be to someone losing their job, a career that they could have had for 2 to 3 decades, and oh, it's easy, just learn this new skill?
Yeah,
Because let's be realistic, that is hard to do. But so that's a part of the issue that with the Dutch farmers, they would be receiving such a laughably small, like maybe, you know, such a small settlement from the Dutch government for them to lose their livelihood. And that's where just part of the disconnect is coming from, where people are snapping, saying, no, this is outrageous. I'm not going to be pushed out of farming, which is important for our food independence. And also, too, this has been my career forever. It's certainly a job that, while it contributes to the well-being of the European Union with its food independence, it doesn't pay them well, despite with how hard they work. And just part of the issue, too, is that the European Union also, I do notice this a lot, is that there's a big push where we're so concerned about controlling man-made emissions that we're also not looking at the reality that the Earth also goes through cycles and that we've come in and out of ice ages long before there was industrialization. So while yes, we should be concerned with what us as humans are doing to the environment, we should try to protect it as much as we can. We also have to be realistic and realize that we cannot play God, that sometimes that the earth does warm up or cool, not 100% because of man-made activity. And that's what people aren't willing to acknowledge. And that's just part of the issue too, that with some solutions that we know could work, such as potentially with nuclear energy, you're having a big push towards people with electric cars. And as you know, part of the issue is, okay, but when you go to charge that car, if it's coal plants in Germany powering that electricity, you did absolutely nothing.
yeah,
And part of the issue too that a lot of people aren't talking about when they push electric cars is, except for Portugal, which potentially could become a lithium producing nation, a lot of lithium comes from poor nations in the world where they do not care about the environment at all. It's an open pit mine with huge environmental degradation, and also looking at how horrific the conditions are for workers, where these nations don't care if these workers die at very young ages. They just want to be able to mine the lithium and to be able to sell it to nations eager with looking to try to shift towards greener technology, but looking at, okay, but this is still causing huge environmental damage, and people aren't acknowledging that. Where it's interesting. We'll have to see whether there's more of a shift where people will realize that electric cars do have some issues, and whether people will then re-examine looking at hydrogen cars and realize, okay, are electric cars really worth it, considering how much damage they could cause to the environment? Because also just looking at Portugal real quick, they realized that these mines would have a very short lifespan. So there's been huge protests in rural communities nearby realizing, well, wait a minute, you're going to have these huge mines that might be able to be open for a maximum of 15 years. So you're going to permanently change the environmental landscape for 15 years of economic activity, and that's it. And will these companies actually be excellent about putting everything back as best as they could? Or is it just going to be, okay, we destroyed the environment, oh well, but we helped create electric cars with Portuguese lithium? That's not better for the environment then. And it just, people have to keep on looking at the input costs and realizing we have to be, for example, with different debates. I took a urban planning course in high school and then also with college. And as people famously mentioned, that people try to say, oh, well, with cities, there's greener ways of planning them rather than having them be more car dependent, for example, as many American cities are. But as people excellently point out, it's not necessarily greener to destroy an entire city and start from scratch to try to make it greener. But look at all the pollution you're then putting out by leveling the entire city to start from scratch. That's not necessarily beneficial for the environment if you're producing significant emissions by trying to start over. It's more for, okay, well, what practices could we incorporate into newer cities, into newer development?
Yeah, indeed. So thank you very much, Nick, for your thoughts. It's incredible that we can have such interesting discussion. But that's it for today, for this episode. We invite you, ladies and gentlemen, to join us on this journey of exploration and analyze as we navigate to complexities of the political landscape within the European Union. Stay uploaded with our latest insights and discussions by following us on social media and subscribing to our YouTube channel. Your engagement and feedback are invaluable as we continue to unpack the pressing issues shaping our world. Thank you very much, Nick. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. So be sure to tune in for our next episodes. And until then, stay informed, stay engaged, and thank you for being part of the conversation.
And thank you for being so patient, for listening to my various tangents and me trying to cram so many subjects into one episode. So be sure to go ahead and comment on what you agreed and what you disagreed with. And thank you so much if you made it to the entire end of this episode.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nick, and we'll keep in touch.
Yes, we will.